On a fog-shrouded morning in November 1944, in a makeshift field hospital just behind the front lines in eastern France, a Red Cross nurse named Margaret Sullivan held the hand of a dying soldier and made him a promise she had no idea how to keep. The soldier, Private First Class Daniel Carter from a small town in Kentucky, had been pulled from a burning tank after a German counterattack near the Vosges Mountains. His injuries were catastrophic, his chances of survival almost non-existent. But in those final hours, as morphine dulled his pain and death crept closer, he asked Margaret to do something that would change her life forever. Find his younger brother, also fighting somewhere in Europe, and tell him that Daniel's last thoughts were of home, of family, of the fishing creek behind their childhood house where they'd spent countless summer afternoons. Margaret promised. She held his hand until his last breath. And then she spent the next 6 months searching for a soldier she'd never met, driven by a vow made to a dying man. What she didn't expect was that finding Thomas Carter would lead to a love so profound it would redefine everything she thought she knew about duty, grief, and the human heart's capacity to heal even the deepest wounds. This is their story, a love born from a promise made in death's shadow. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more untold wartime love stories that history tried to forget. Tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Margaret Sullivan was 26 years old in the autumn of 1944, a registered nurse from Philadelphia, who'd volunteered for the American Red Cross in early 1943. She came from a medical family. Her father was a surgeon, her older brother a Navy doctor serving in the Pacific. Margaret had grown up surrounded by medicine, by the understanding that healing was both science and calling, that sometimes the greatest act of compassion was simply being present when someone needed you most. She'd arrived in Europe in June 1944, just weeks after D-Day, assigned to a mobile field hospital that moved with the advancing American forces. The work was brutal and relentless, an endless stream of wounded soldiers, insufficient supplies, impossible decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. Margaret had learned to compartmentalize her emotions, to see each patient as a medical problem rather than as someone's son or brother or husband. It was the only way to survive the work without breaking. But Daniel Carter had gotten through her defenses. He'd arrived at the field hospital on November 18, 1944, brought in from the 14th Armored Division after a German Panther tank had ambushed his Sherman near the town of Baccarat. The Sherman had been hit, catching fire instantly. 2 crew members had died in the initial explosion. Daniel and one other had been pulled out by their squad, both critically burned and injured by shrapnel. Margaret had been on duty when they brought Daniel in. One look told her he wouldn't survive. Burns covering more than 60% of his body. Internal injuries from the explosion, already showing signs of shock. The other nurse suggested they move him to the tent where they kept soldiers who were beyond saving, let him die with morphine to ease the pain, but without wasting precious medical resources that could save others. But something in Daniel's eyes stopped Margaret. He was conscious, aware, terrified. And he was so young. The chart said 23, but he looked even younger, with that baby-faced quality that made Margaret think of her own younger cousins back in Philadelphia. "Please," Daniel had whispered when she leaned close to hear him. "Don't leave me alone. I don't want to die alone." Margaret made a decision that went against protocol and practicality. She stayed. She pulled up a stool beside his cot in the critical care tent, held his hand, and talked to him quietly, as morphine dulled the worst of his pain. They talked for hours. Daniel told her about growing up in Kentucky, about his parents who ran a small tobacco farm, about his younger brother Thomas who'd enlisted a year after Daniel. They'd trained separately, been assigned to different units, Daniel to armored cavalry, Thomas to infantry. Daniel hadn't seen his brother since they'd both shipped overseas, but he knew Thomas was somewhere in France, with the 36th Infantry Division. "Tommy's the smart one," Daniel said, his voice growing weaker as the afternoon wore on. "Should have stayed in college, should have gotten a deferment. But he wanted to serve, wanted to be like his big brother. God, I hope he's okay. I hope this war doesn't destroy him the way it's destroyed so many." Margaret listened, occasionally wiping his forehead with a cool cloth, adjusting his morphine when the pain broke through. She told him about Philadelphia, about her family, about the strange disconnect of being surrounded by death, while letters from home talked about rationing and victory gardens and neighborhood gossip that seemed impossibly distant. Evening fell and Daniel's breathing grew more labored. He gripped Margaret's hand with surprising strength. "I need you to do something for me," he said, each word an effort. "Please, find Tommy. Find my brother. Tell him—" He stopped, gathering strength. "Tell him I wasn't scared at the end. Tell him I thought about home, about fishing at Miller's Creek, about Mom's Sunday dinners. Tell him to go home when this is over, to live a good life, to not waste time on things that don't matter. Can you do that, please?" Margaret knew she shouldn't make such a promise. The American Army had hundreds of thousands of men scattered across Europe. Finding one specific soldier, with no information beyond his name and division, would be nearly impossible. But Daniel's eyes held such desperate hope, such need to believe his final message would reach his brother. "I promise," Margaret said. "I'll find him. I'll tell him everything." Daniel Carter died at 11:47 p.m. on November 18, 1944. Margaret stayed with him until the end, holding his hand, telling him about the creek behind her childhood home where she'd caught her first fish, giving him peaceful images to carry into whatever came next. After his death, as Margaret filled out the required paperwork and prepared Daniel's body for burial, she found herself unable to let go of the promise. She'd made hundreds of vows to dying soldiers, promises to write their families, to tell sweethearts how much they were loved, to convey final messages. She'd kept those promises when possible, but always from a distance, through letters that maintained professional boundaries. This felt different. Daniel had asked her to find his brother personally, to deliver the message face to face, and Margaret felt compelled to honor that request, even though she had no idea how. The 36th Infantry Division, Thomas Carter's unit, was somewhere in the Vosges Mountains, engaged in brutal combat against German forces defending the approaches to the Rhine River. Margaret's field hospital was with the 7th Army, operating in roughly the same sector but constantly moving as the front lines shifted. She began making inquiries through official channels, trying to locate Private Thomas Carter through military personnel records. The Army bureaucracy was overwhelmed by the demands of active combat operations. Her inquiries disappeared into a system stretched beyond capacity. Days passed, then weeks. The field hospital moved 3 times as American forces pushed deeper into eastern France toward the German border. Margaret continued her work, treating wounded soldiers, comforting dying men, maintaining the professional detachment that kept her sane. But she couldn't forget Daniel Carter, or the promise she'd made. In early December, Margaret got her first break. A chaplain she'd worked with mentioned that the 36th Division had taken heavy casualties in fighting near a town called Saint-Dié-des-Vosges, and that wounded, from that battle, were being evacuated to various field hospitals, including hers. If Thomas Carter had been injured, he might come through Margaret's station. She began checking every incoming wounded soldier from the 36th Division, looking for Thomas Carter's name. She questioned medics and litter-bearers, showed them Daniel's dog tags which she'd kept, against regulations, in hopes they might help identify his brother. The 36th Division had thousands of men. The chances of Thomas Carter being wounded and evacuated specifically to her hospital were minuscule. But on December 8, 1944, a convoy of ambulances arrived carrying casualties from a German artillery barrage near Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines. Among them was Private Thomas Carter, Company G, 141st Infantry Regiment, 36th Infantry Division. Shrapnel wounds to his right leg and shoulder, not life-threatening but serious enough to require evacuation from the front lines. Margaret was supervising the triage when she saw his name on the casualty list. Her heart lurched. For a month, she'd been searching for this soldier, carrying his brother's final message, wondering if she'd ever actually find him. And now he was here, being carried into her hospital on a stretcher, covered in mud and blood, and the 1,000-yard stare that combat infantrymen developed after too many battles. She waited until the surgeons had finished treating his wounds, and he'd been moved to the recovery tent. Then, as her shift ended, she approached his cot. Thomas Carter was 21 years old, with the same dark hair and angular features as his brother, but with harder eyes, a grimmer set to his mouth. The boyish quality Daniel had retained even in death was completely absent from Thomas. This was someone who'd seen too much, survived too much, and expected nothing good from the world anymore. Margaret pulled up a stool beside his cot. Thomas watched her approach with the wary suspicion of a combat soldier who'd learned to trust nothing and no one. "Private Carter," Margaret said gently. "My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm a Red Cross nurse. I need to talk to you about your brother, Daniel." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Fear, hope, dread. "What about him? Is he okay? Have you heard something?" Margaret's throat tightened. She'd rehearsed this moment dozens of times, practiced the words she'd use. But now, faced with Thomas Carter's desperate hope, the practiced words felt inadequate. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "Daniel was wounded in action on November 18th near Baccarat. He was brought to my field hospital. I was with him at the end. He asked me to find you, to give you a message." She watched the light die in Thomas's eyes, watched him process the information with the numb acceptance of someone who'd already lost too much to react dramatically. He simply nodded once, then looked away. What was the message? His voice was flat, emotionless, Margaret told him. Every word Daniel had said, every memory he'd shared about Miller's Creek and their mother's Sunday dinners, every hope he'd expressed for Thomas's future. She told him how Daniel had died, peacefully, without pain at the end, thinking of home. Thomas listened without expression, staring at the canvas ceiling of the hospital tent. When Margaret finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Thank you for staying with him," he finally said. "Danny was always afraid of being alone. Even as a kid, he hated the dark, hated being by himself. Knowing someone was there at the end, that matters. Thank you." "He spoke about you with such love," Margaret said. "He was so proud of you. He called you the smart one, said you should have stayed in college." Thomas laughed bitterly. Smart would have been staying in college. Smart would have been not enlisting just because Danny did. But I couldn't let him fight alone. Couldn't let him be over here while I was safe at home. He finally looked at Margaret. "Lot of good it did. He's dead anyway, and I wasn't there to help him." "You couldn't have known," Margaret said gently. "You were serving with your unit, doing your duty. Daniel understood that. Did he?" Thomas's voice was sharp with pain. "Or did he die thinking his little brother had abandoned him?" Margaret reached out and took Thomas's hand, the same gesture she'd offered his brother in his final hours. "He died proud of you, hopeful for your future, wanting you to survive and go home and live the life he wouldn't get to live. That's what he told me to tell you. Don't dishonor his memory by carrying guilt he never wanted you to bear." Thomas looked at their clasped hands, and for the first time, his emotional armor cracked. Tears slipped down his face, and his shoulders shook with sobs he'd been holding back since the moment Margaret had told him Daniel was dead. Margaret stayed with him, just as she'd stayed with Daniel, and somewhere in that shared grief, in the connection forged by a dying man's final wish, something unexpected began to form between Margaret Sullivan and Thomas Carter. Thomas's wounds required several weeks of recovery before he could return to duty. During that time, Margaret found herself drawn to his bedside whenever her shifts allowed. She told herself it was about honoring her promise to Daniel, about making sure Thomas understood his brother's final message. But it was more than that, and she knew it. Thomas was different from most of the soldiers she'd treated. He was quieter, more introspective, with a depth of thought that suggested he'd been a serious student before the war. They began talking about things beyond the war, books they'd read, places they'd hoped to visit, dreams they'd had before the world went mad. Thomas had been studying engineering at the University of Kentucky before enlisting. He'd wanted to design bridges, to build structures that would last beyond his lifetime. He talked about the paradox of being trained to destroy things when all he'd ever wanted was to create. Margaret shared her own struggles, the difficulty of maintaining compassion in the face of endless suffering, the guilt of being unable to save everyone, the question of how to return to normal life after witnessing such horror. Danny used to say that the war would end and we'd go back to who we were before, Thomas said one evening as December rain drummed on the hospital tent. But I don't think that's possible. We're not the same people who enlisted. How do we go back to caring about normal things when we've seen what we've seen? Maybe we don't go back, Margaret replied. Maybe we go forward, build new lives with the understanding we've gained, honor the people we've lost by living fully, by creating beauty and meaning out of this destruction. Is that what you'll do? After the war? Margaret considered the question. Before the war, she'd planned to work in her father's practice, marry someone suitable from her social circle, live the comfortable upper-middle-class life she'd been raised for. But that future seemed hollow now, insufficient to contain everything she'd experienced. I think I'll need to do something that matters, she said slowly. Work with veterans, maybe. Help soldiers transition back to civilian life. Use what I've learned here to make a real difference, not just treat colds and set broken bones. Thomas looked at her with something that might have been admiration. Danny was right about one thing. There are still good people in the world. People like you who keep their promises even when it's hard. Their relationship deepened over the following weeks. Margaret wasn't sure when gratitude and shared grief transformed into something more. But by the time Thomas was cleared to return to his unit in early January 1945, she realized she'd fallen in love with him. It was complicated and probably unwise. A Red Cross nurse and a combat infantryman, meeting through the death of the infantryman's brother, conducting a relationship in the middle of a war zone. But it was also real, perhaps more real than anything Margaret had felt before, stripped of peacetime pretense and built on genuine understanding and shared pain. The night before Thomas was scheduled to return to the 36th Division, he and Margaret walked together outside the hospital compound, bundled against the January cold. I don't know how to do this, Thomas said quietly. How to go back to combat knowing what I have to lose now. Before, I didn't care much if I survived. Felt like I was already dead in the ways that mattered. But now you have a reason to survive, Margaret finished. That's not weakness, Thomas. That's what we're fighting for. The right to build lives worth living. What happens after the war? Thomas asked. Assuming we both survive, assuming this madness ends, what happens with us? Margaret took his hand. We figure it out together. You finish your degree, design your bridges. I work with veterans, help people heal. We build something good out of all this grief and loss. We honor Daniel by living the kind of life he wanted for you. Thomas pulled her close, and they kissed under the cold January stars. Two people finding hope in the middle of humanity's greatest catastrophe. I love you, Thomas said. I know it's fast. I know it's crazy. But I love you, Margaret Sullivan. I love you too, Margaret replied. Come back to me. Whatever it takes, survive and come back to me. Thomas returned to the 36th Infantry Division on January 5, 1945. The division was preparing for Operation Nordwind, a German counteroffensive in Alsace. For the next 4 months, Margaret and Thomas maintained their relationship through letters, hastily written notes smuggled through the mail system, expressing love and fear and desperate hope for a future beyond the war. Margaret's letters were full of practical plans for that future, where they might live, what they'd do, how they'd honor Daniel's memory by building the life he'd dreamed of for his brother. Thomas's letters were shorter, more cautious, as if he was afraid to hope too much. Then, in late April 1945, as German resistance collapsed and the war in Europe entered its final days, Margaret received a telegram that stopped her heart. Private Thomas Carter wounded in action April 22, 1945. Serious condition. Evacuated to 72nd Evacuation Hospital, Nuremberg. Margaret immediately requested a transfer, pulling every string available to get reassigned to the 72nd Evacuation Hospital. By the time she arrived, 3 days later, Thomas had undergone 2 surgeries for wounds sustained during the crossing of the Danube River. Shrapnel from a German artillery shell had struck him in the chest and abdomen. The surgeons had saved his life, but his recovery would be long and uncertain. Margaret found him in a recovery ward, pale and weak, but alive. When he saw her, tears streamed down his face. "You came," he whispered. "I was afraid I'd die before seeing you again." "You're not dying," Margaret said firmly, taking his hand just as she'd taken his brother's months earlier. But this time, she wasn't watching someone slip away. She was watching someone fight to stay. "I made a promise to your brother that I'd find you and deliver his message. I kept that promise. Now, I'm making a promise to you. We're both surviving this war, and we're building that future we talked about." Thomas recovered slowly over the following weeks as the war in Europe ended. VE Day came on May 8, 1945, and the hospital staff celebrated while their patients, men who'd paid the price for that victory, tried to comprehend that the war was finally over. Thomas and Margaret married in August 1945, in a simple ceremony at a chapel in Heidelberg, Germany, where Thomas was completing his recovery. His parents traveled from Kentucky, and Margaret's family came from Philadelphia. It was small and intimate, attended by fellow nurses, recovering soldiers, and the chaplain who'd helped Margaret locate Thomas 6 months earlier. Standing at the altar, exchanging vows, Margaret thought about Daniel Carter and the promise that had brought her and Thomas together. She'd kept that promise, found Thomas, delivered Daniel's message, helped him understand his brother's final wishes. But the promise had given her something unexpected in return. Love, partnership, a future she'd never imagined. After the war, Thomas finished his engineering degree on the GI Bill. Margaret worked with veterans organizations, helping wounded soldiers transition to civilian life. They settled in Kentucky, near Thomas's family farm, and built a life that honored Daniel's memory. Full, purposeful, focused on creation rather than destruction. They had 3 children. The oldest, a son, they named Daniel. Thomas designed bridges throughout Kentucky and Tennessee, graceful structures spanning rivers and valleys, built to last beyond his lifetime, each one a small act of creation in a world that had seen too much destruction. Margaret opened a clinic for veterans, providing not just medical care, but counseling and support for men struggling to readjust to peace. And every year, on November 18th, the anniversary of Daniel's death, Thomas and Margaret would visit Miller's Creek, the fishing spot Daniel had mentioned in his final hours. They'd stand on the bank, watching the water flow, and remember the man whose death had brought them together, and whose memory had given their lives deeper meaning. Thomas Carter died in 1998, at the age of 74. Margaret lived another 15 years, dying peacefully in 2013, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Among her effects, her family found a small wooden box containing every letter Thomas had written her during the war, along with a journal she'd kept starting from the day she met Daniel Carter. The journal entries told the full story. The promise made to a dying soldier, the search for his brother, the unexpected love that grew from shared grief, the life they'd built together. Margaret's final entry, written just weeks before her death, read, "I've spent 68 years with Thomas, building the life Daniel wanted for his brother. We've created beauty from tragedy, love from loss, hope from despair. Daniel died believing his message would reach Thomas, believing his brother would survive and thrive. I kept that promise, and in keeping it, I found my own salvation. The war took so much from so many people, but it also taught me that love can emerge from the darkest circumstances. The promises made in death's shadow are sacred, and that sometimes the people we're meant to love come into our lives through the most unexpected paths. Daniel Carter gave me Thomas, and Thomas gave me a lifetime of meaning. I will carry that gratitude into whatever comes next." The story of Margaret Sullivan and Thomas Carter, and the promise that bound them together, was documented by their granddaughter in 2015 in a book titled Miller's Creek, A Promise Kept. The book became a bestseller, resonating with readers who understood that love stories don't always begin with meet-cutes and romantic gestures. Sometimes they begin with death and duty, and a promise made to a dying soldier. The book's epilogue describes a memorial established by the Carter family at Miller's Creek, a simple stone marker commemorating Daniel Carter, who died at 23 in the service of his country, and whose final act was to bring his brother and the woman his brother would love together. The inscription reads, PFC Daniel Carter, 1921–1944. His last gift to his brother was a message of love. That message created a legacy that outlasted the war and proved that even in death, acts of love echo through generations. Every year, members of the Carter family gather at Miller's Creek on November 18th, continuing the tradition Thomas and Margaret started. They fish, tell stories, and remember that their family exists because a dying soldier made a request and a compassionate nurse kept her promise. Because that's what the story of Margaret and Thomas ultimately proves, that promises matter, that compassion creates connections that transcend tragedy, and that sometimes the deepest loves are born, not from easy circumstances, but from the shared experience of loss and the determination to honor those who are gone by living fully. When the Red Cross nurse met the dying soldier, neither knew that their brief encounter would set in motion a love story that would span decades. Daniel Carter couldn't have known that his final request would give his brother a reason to survive, a partner to build a life with, a future worth living. Margaret couldn't have known that a promise made in a moment of compassion would define the rest of her life. But it did. And in a war that killed millions, in a conflict that brought out humanity's worst, their story reminds us of humanity's best, the capacity for compassion even in extremity, the willingness to keep promises even when it's hard, and the understanding that love, in all its forms, is what makes survival worthwhile. But this wasn't the only time a promise made in death's shadow created unexpected love. In our next story, you'll meet Lieutenant Catherine Wade, a combat photographer who promised a dying Marine she'd deliver his camera and final photographs to his wife back home, only to discover that the wife had never stopped loving the husband she'd divorced before he shipped out, and that delivering those final images would force Catherine to confront her own fears about love, loss, and the courage required to let someone in when you've spent years keeping everyone out.